Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. I am back and ready to talk more about ghosts and hauntings in Astoria, New York. I think this episode is going to be a little bit more lighthearted than the last two, which also looked at some dark parts of Astoria's history. This week I kind of just want to look at a few stories of haunted houses, and then for the next episode, the week after next, I probably want to talk about some more Astoria haunted houses, because there were a handful of interesting stories about supposedly haunted houses here. And then, after I'm done talking about the haunted houses I want to talk about in this episode, I also wanted to give some updates about some interesting places I've gone recently that I thought people would like to hear about. So, let's look at a story from Long Island City, which is the neighborhood that is adjacent to Astoria. And sometimes the neighborhood's names are used interchangeably. So this story definitely does take place in Long Island City, what we would think of as Long Island City today. So the story comes from the New York Daily Herald from Thursday, January 29th, 1874. Though I also found an article with other information about the story printed in the Mower County transcript from Lansing, Minnesota. So I assume that was a reprint from some other source. The Mower County transcript article starts out, Long Island City has a new sensation in the shape of a haunted house situated on Jackson Avenue. Side note, the Daily Herald article says that the house is on Dutch Kills Road, 2 miles from Hunters Point. And this house in Long Island City had some issues and it could not be rented out. And of course, those issues were ghosts or some sort of haunting. So the landlord finally found a family that would move into the building for what the newspapers called a nominal sum, so I assume that means extremely reduced rent. According to the Herald, the family said, quote, they were not afraid of ghosts or the old boy himself. Old boy is capitalized, and I assume it means the devil. So this family that was not afraid of ghosts consisted of 5 people, and this was a small house, so there were people in basically every room except the parlor and kitchen in terms of, where people are sleeping, etc. So shortly after they moved in, the residents heard a low moaning sound, and the father of the family, Mr. Daly, got up and went into the hall thinking that someone had a cold because it was a bitterly cold night. And that's a very 19th century way of thinking, right? Like, it's chilly outside. Somebody probably got a cold from the cold. But at any rate, he gets up and he hears the sound again, and it sounds like it's coming from the kitchen. But then he goes to the kitchen and he doesn't hear it in the kitchen anymore. He hears it in the parlor. And then when he goes to the parlor, he hears it in the kitchen again. So sounds like a sort of trickster vibe going on here. Maybe a poltergeist kind of thing. Sounds like at this point he gave up and he went to bed because he couldn't locate the source of the sound, and I assume it was late and he wanted to sleep. A little bit later, he heard a body fall down the stairs, and then he heard what was described as deep sepulchral groans, which apparently came from the garret and the hall. In the kitchen, the crockery was thrown out of the cupboards and onto the floor, so again, very poltergeist-like. The next day, there were more sounds, including someone crying murder and scaring people. So far this sounds like a pretty standard poltergeist sort of thing, but it gets really dark really quickly. So the New York Herald article just drops in, one of the children was so thoroughly frightened that it was thrown into spasm and its life is now despaired of. And then the Mower County transcript article sadly says that the child was so scared that they were thrown into convulsions and died. So this story that starts out as sort of a fun, weird poltergeist haunting ends up turning deadly in a really sad way. And both articles kind of just throw that detail in there and then move on. And they talk about how the premises were overhauled, so I assume that means like examined thoroughly. And they couldn't solve the mystery of the weird sounds. And then the Daly family moved out pretty quickly, saying that, quote, they weren't afraid to stay, but they couldn't sleep at night. Which, fair enough, except why isn't the quote, "We're not going to stay here because one of our children died out of fear"? You know? Really a strange decision when saying their logic on moving out. So that was a case of a funny little haunting in Long Island City that turned deadly. So next, this is from an article in the New York Tribune from November 23rd, 1858. So it was a reprint from the New Jerusalem Messenger, which was a New York City religious newspaper of the Swedenborgian denomination. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful here, but I read that for a second and was just like, what on earth is that? It sounds like something from a science fiction show. But it was a religion that was started by a person named Emanuel Swedenborg. And as his name might suggest, he was a Swedish inventor, scientist, theologian, philosopher, and mystic. And he experienced dreams and visions, and he claimed that after a spiritual awakening, he developed the ability to visit heaven and hell to talk to angels, demons, and ghosts at will. So when I say that this was a religious newspaper, that's the kind of religion it is. And like, no disrespect to Swedenborgianism, but, you know, if you're imagining sort of a fire and brimstone kind of thing, that's not really what this is about as a newspaper, it seems. So with that context, let's get to the article, which was headlined, "The Haunted House in Astoria." So this tells the story of a haunted house that couldn't be rented out because it was so haunted. So it starts out similarly to the last story. The former owner was burned to death in the house, and since then, the ghost visited the house every night, making noises and opening and closing locked doors without unlocking them, opening windows and tossing plates onto the grass outside, while leaving some of the plates still in the cabinets, and scaring the watchdog so much that he would run to his owner, thinking that the owner was in danger. So again, real poltergeist vibes here. And this story was relayed by a former tenant who was a military man who had to leave because whenever he hired servants, they would quit. However, that sounds like a really convenient excuse. I bet this guy was freaked out, and it's easier to be like, "Oh, I can't maintain a household here because my servants keep quitting. They're the ones who are scared, not me." So at any rate, over the previous summer, the house had stood empty, and the newspaper sent reporters to investigate the house. They didn't encounter anything, and they theorized that maybe rats were making the noises. But since the house was unoccupied, the owner found a poor family who would live there for free. At first, the housekeeper, which I assume would be the wife of the family, I assume they didn't have a live-in housekeeper, because if they were so poor they needed to live somewhere rent-free, they probably didn't have servants. At any rate, the housekeeper said that there was no haunting, but then she told a neighbor later that, quote, "Sure enough, there is a ghost in the house." This next part I found really interesting, kind of in the same way that a couple episodes ago I thought it was really interesting that there was a haunted house in Astoria where a man's daughter came to him from the afterlife as a ghost, and she was knitting this like almost spider web sort of material, and as she was knitting it, the material was like fading from sight, and anytime she stopped knitting, she would start to fade, and I thought that was so interesting. And then I found this woman's strategy for proving that there was a ghost also very interesting. Maybe I think of them together because they're both sort of like sewing or knitting things. But so this woman, she produced evidence by fastening a strong black thread to a large needle, and she sewed it to a pincushion on the table. And then she found that the needle and thread both disappeared, and she looked for them and she eventually found them. So let me read from the article that reports what she saw. High up, the needle still fastened to the thread, but suspended and hanging downwards, while the rest of the thread was most curiously woven together and adhered to the shutter without anything to hold it. This supernatural work could not, of course, be done by anyone but a ghost. Ellen Green, an intelligent young woman, after attentively listening to her neighbor, went with her to the haunted house to examine this mysterious thread and needle. Sure enough, There were the needle and thread as described. But anxious to solve the mystery, she picked up the thread from the shutter and perceived that it had adhered by means of a spider's web, and just above she beheld the ghost in the shape of a hideous large black spider, a most fitting representative of all ghost stories, as spiders' webs correspond to falses and treachery. So I found this really interesting in several ways, right? Like I talked earlier about the ghost of the girl who was knitting, and in this case, there was a piece of thread that was woven together, and then it was held by a woven spider's web. So I'm just going to keep an eye out for more stuff about ghosts weaving things, because that's just not an association I had with ghosts prior to this. But it feels just strange that in just looking at the hauntings that supposedly happened in this neighborhood, there's multiple ones, kind of the more plausible, in quotation marks, ones, have really interesting details about someone weaving. And I'm gonna have to dig in and try to see if I can find anything like, was weaving a thing in spiritualism? I didn't think it was, but maybe there was some like association with it that just isn't that commonly known now. I don't know. I think this article's a little funny because it really takes this woman, it takes what she says as fact without unpacking it at all. Like, I thought it was a little bit weird how it says, oh yeah, she saw the ghost in the shape of a huge spider. And I was like, well, that's just a spider, maybe. But it is notable that something was able to be pulled out of the pincushion and then brought over to the window. So I guess that's what it was kind of implying, but it feels to me like maybe the spider wasn't the ghost. Maybe the ghost was just not present at this moment and put it in a spider web. I don't know, but it's really interesting. So I also wanted to talk about some ghostly false alarms, just as a reminder that while these stories are super interesting, they should also be taken with a large grain of salt, because I sort of feel like in this time period, newspapers would kind of just print anything that seemed sort of interesting. So this is an article from the same day as the last one, from November 23rd, 1858. This was published in the Evening Post, and this article was called Another Haunted House in Astoria. So the story begins. Astoria seems to be full of ghosts. We yesterday published the story of the haunted house in Astoria. Today we have another from the same correspondent. Wouldn't it be fun to be on like the Astoria ghost beat? I know I'm like sort of on that, but it's not a job, it's just a hobby. This article tells the story of a roadside inn in Astoria where a landlord had died. Then the guests found that if they tried to stay in the room where he had died, the ghost would, quote, shake him out. Not totally sure what that means, but here it is in context to read a little bit of it. Quote, several having tried and got a good shaking, the use of the chamber had to be abandoned. So I guess that just means that like they tried to sleep and then the whole bed started shaking or something. So interesting, right? You hear this and you're like, okay, maybe this is a poltergeist sort of thing. It says it's a haunted house. But this is actually sort of a debunking article. So it tells the story of how one cold night, a weary traveler stayed in the room since it was the only vacant one. And to read a little bit more from it, as he was very tired, he determined that no ghost should shake him out. But he had no sooner dropped asleep than the whistling of the wind, the creaking of rusty hinges, and a violent shaking of his bed awoke him. Nothing daunted, but with the right spirit of inquiry, he concluded that the natural results must have natural causes. So, to make a long story short, he discovered, or at least theorized, that the shaking and creaking came from the inn's swinging sign. Kind of, that old-fashioned, like, wooden swinging sign outside of an inn. And that was attached to a loose beam that went into the room. And the bed rested against that beam. So when the wind blew, it shook the sign, which shook the beam, which shook the bed. So to test it out, he moves the bed into the middle of the room, and he goes to sleep, and he was not awoken again. While I admire this article's honesty, it was an article where I was like, all right, I'm so excited about another haunted house in Astoria. And then I read it and I was like, Well, there's no haunting. That's the point of this. And I think it kind of just shows the willingness of newspapers to be like, oh, this isn't a story at all? Well, let's print it. And if stories like this get printed when there's not much to say, that kind of feels to me like, newspapers would just print whatever because, it fills column inches. People like stuff about hauntings. And I don't know, I just think it's a good indication or a good benchmark to have when thinking about how well vetted ghost stories in newspapers are, etc. I saw another false alarm ghost story in the June 28th, 1888 issue of the Brooklyn Times Union, which had a story headlined, "It was a white horse and something that looked like a red-headed ghost leading it." This one is so silly to me. So it relays the story of one John Thompson, who was apparently a well-known figure in Astoria and who resided near Cook's training stables. I can't say quite where that would be in Astoria, but I did look at a map of old Astoria in 1873, and there were several livery stables near the water. And, people tended to live near the water at the time. So perhaps it's one of those, though also maybe it was just a stable that wasn't on the map. But one side note, for all of these ghost stories, I've been trying to locate them on maps to kind of see if there's correlations between where stories are occurring or where things used to be. So I'll let you guys know if and when a certain location is very interesting to me. But even if it's not super interesting, I do try to mention where I think things might be for fellow Astorians who might be curious about where it is. So, in this newspaper article, it tells the story about how one night Thompson heard a horse moving around the yard. So, he started to get dressed so he could catch the horse and bring it back to the stable. When he went outside, he saw the horse quietly eating grass near an Alderman Gibson's house. He was about to lead the horse away, and then he heard a window open and a woman yell, "Take that horse out of this yard, sir! How dare you bring your horse in here to eat our grass?" And then the horse turns around, and the woman sees the man in a white robe, and supposedly she yelled to her husband that, quote, "there was a red-headed ghost in the yard leading a white horse." So another thing that both of these sort of fake haunting stories really underscores is people's tendency to want to say that things are caused by paranormal phenomena when it's actually just really their imagination. That's not to say that, of course, real hauntings can happen, etc. But it is a good reminder to always take these sorts of reports with a grain of salt, however delightful they might be. Also, I just have to pause. I know I'm sort of contradicting myself, and I'm sure, this is probably just a fun coincidence. But coincidentally, this is the second time that I've recorded a podcast episode about haunted houses, and I've had doors in my living room just open and close randomly. Now, you might actually be able to hear the wind in the background. Right when I started talking about how a lot of hauntings are maybe people's imagination running away with them, the wind really picked up outside and it's blowing through the air conditioner across the room. But while I was reading from one of those articles, I had the door to the bedroom just pop open. And then right now I'm plugged into my microphone, which means that all the sounds in the room are super magnified. And the wind's been blowing, and I keep hearing a door close. However, right now I can see the door to the study, I can see the door to the bedroom, I can see the door to the kitchen. And the bedroom door is open now, the door to the kitchen is open now, and I'm 2 feet away from the door to the study, and that's closed very solidly. So that's just a little bit weird because I keep hearing, probably at least 3 times now, I've heard really distinctly a door click shut, and it's not any of the doors in the apartment. I just got up and walked. There's a second kitchen door. That door is propped open and hasn't moved. The only other door in the apartment is the bathroom door and the closet doors, which have not moved. So, like I said, this is probably a total coincidence, but it just stood out to me because when I did the story about the haunted house in Nyack, New York, I think it was that episode. It was the Ghostbusters ruling episode. I was talking about commonly heard and experienced phenomena that people have reported when they say their houses are haunted. And one of them was like, I think I said strange noises or something similar, and the door to my bedroom just opened. And full disclosure, there is something weird with the doors in our apartment where they open and close on their own sometimes, even when they're like definitely shut. And I've checked, and I don't know what the parts of a door are called. The thing that when you turn the knob, it withdraws into the door, and then when you let go, it goes back out and kind of like keeps the door in place. I often check to make sure that is stuck, like that's put in its place, so that way you can't just push the door open. And even when I do that, the door to the study, to the bedroom, and to the kitchen, sometimes they just randomly open. And right now, it seems totally reasonable that a door might open because it's very windy, but it happened before we installed our air conditioners in the winter when all the doors were closed. It happened a little bit, but now that we're using the air conditioners, we've been trying to close all of the doors so that way we just air condition the room we're in and not the whole apartment. So as we've been trying to close doors, we've found that they just, with increasing frequently, just open themselves. And it was actually pretty funny. A couple months ago, my sister and her fiance came to visit us, and they're both very afraid of ghosts. And we were all sitting around talking in the living room, and we were not talking about ghosts at all. And during this conversation, multiple times, the doors opened and closed. And then at one point, I think 2 opened in unison. And my sister just turns to me, and she was so mad. She was just like, "What did you do?" And I was like, "I haven't done anything. The doors just do this." But there's definitely a little bit of weirdness in our house. Like, I've had lamps turn on and off kind of randomly and that sort of thing. But it's always so funny to me when I talk about haunted houses and then like the doors open and close around me. Also, side note, you might be able to hear, it suddenly started hailing outside, which is extremely unusual for New York City. Like, I've lived here 13 years and can count on probably like one hand the number of hailstorms I can remember. So, weird day, weird weather. It's probably just the wind today, even though on days that aren't windy, I have this sort of thing happen too. But today there's a pretty reasonable explanation. So that's all the haunted house stuff I wanted to talk about this time. Like I mentioned earlier, I've got more haunted house content for next week, but I wanted to talk about some other things I thought you guys would find interesting. So one thing is, about a month ago, I went to Philly and went to the cave of Kelpius, which I mentioned in my episode about the Doomsday cult in the 1690s, the Hermits of the Wissahickon, or I think it was called like the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness. They were these pietists who had come from Europe, and they were led by this man named Johannes Kelpius, and they were basically like this celibate religious order / cult who believed that they needed to go to Philadelphia to await the end of the world, which was supposed to happen, off the top of my head, I think it was in 1694, sometime in the 1690s. And the world did not end, but they were in Philly, and they built a meeting house and an observatory, and they did a lot of science and art and stuff. And where they were located is now a park in Philly. It used to be part of Fairmount Park. Now I think it's called like Wissahickon Park or Wissahickon Creek Park. And it's a really cool park. I had no idea when I had done the research that it's not like Central Park, right? It's not like, okay, here's a couple little wild areas and then the rest of it's paved. It's like a park where you would go hiking and mountain biking, which I really didn't expect. And the trip to the Hermits Cave, it's not that far into the park, and it's pretty clearly marked, but just when you turn off the main path, you go down this huge, steep kind of trail, I guess. A steep trail that kind of weaves, and then you get to the cave. Didn't take very long to get there, but I was like, I would have worn different shoes if I had known. This was like not just a hike, but the kind of hike where you're going up a pretty big incline that you sort of have to climb up a little bit. But the cave itself was really cool and really creepy. It was a hot and humid day. It was like mid-June. And, you know, the foliage, the leaves, everything was very green, very lush, but also the air was super thick. It was kind of overcast. It felt so ominous there. And the cave itself, like I've seen pictures of the interior and the exterior, etc., and it was overcast, but it was still bright. You know, it was still a summer day. And the cave itself was basically like there was the entrance, and then when you looked in, it was just like inky black darkness. And I turned on the little flashlight on my phone because I was like, okay, I know this is there's a small interior to this cave where the hermit supposedly lived, or which was maybe a spring house, who knows. And my crappy phone light could not pierce the darkness at all, and I did not go inside the cave. One, because it was very creepy, very dark, but more importantly, it was summer and there were a lot of bugs, and I was really concerned about like walking into a spider web. Or also, I had read something online where someone was complaining about people peeing in there, and I really didn't want to have to smell that or experience that. So I did not go inside, but I looked at it from the outside, and it was really cool and very creepy. A lot creepier than I thought it would be, and I'm sure that's aided by the fact that it's in the middle of the woods. Who knew that Philly had, like, woods that you could hike in Philly? And it was really cool. If you are in Philly for anything, I definitely would recommend going hiking there. It's really beautiful. I wish I could have hiked longer, but all of us were very tired, and it was very, very hot. So we basically saw the cave, walked around a little bit more, and then left. But it was really cool to get to see that. And then also, I recently went on a cool excursion here in Queens. I biked out to Fort Totten, which is a Civil War era fort. And unfortunately, the fort part was closed to the public. I think it's not open super often. I was hoping you could kind of see it through the gate, but you really couldn't. Maybe you can in the winter when there aren't leaves everywhere. But it's an old army base, and now the fire department has a bunch of offices there. I think the NYPD have an office there. There was like a building that was labeled NYPD, and then on the side of the building, there was a giant skeleton that was like sitting on a ledge. And this skeleton was probably like at least 15 feet tall, probably bigger, just on the side of the building, which I thought was weird, but it is the NYPD. They're not good. So it seemed somehow appropriate that they had a giant creepy skeleton on the side of their building. I was like, that's a little on the nose, but okay. And then I think there might have been a couple Coast Guard offices or something in there too. And also the Bayside Historical Society was there. And it was a cool place to go. If you've ever been to Governor's Island in New York City, it was a lot like that because, it was like an old military base. And I was able to bike all around it. And even though I couldn't see the fort, there were all these historic buildings that, you could look and there were signs, here was the mess hall and here was a hospital and here were barracks. But it was so strange because so there were some really nicely maintained buildings, especially, the places where the fire department had set up shop. But then, like, right next to some really nice buildings, there would be, like, an enormous crumbling building. Like, there was an army barracks that had just basically, it was just, like, collapsing. It was covered in vines. There were birds everywhere. It was very cool, but it was literally falling apart. And then there were also all these houses that I guess had been Some of them were officers' houses. I think some of them might have been like regular people's houses, like regular soldiers' houses. I don't know. The houses weren't really labeled, but a ton of those were falling apart. And there was also an old hospital that was so covered in vines, and there were so many trees and like overgrown vegetation around it. And then, there was a chain link fence encircling the whole thing. So much that you could barely see like the dormers on the hospital and the roof, which of course was totally falling apart. And it was just so bizarre because, there were all these families having picnics. There's a nice view of, I think it's Little Neck Bay. It's basically Long Island. Like if you bike all the way out to Bayside, like Whitestone and then Bayside where Fort Totten is, it's basically Long Island. I think it's kind of close to where the Great Gatsby was supposed to be set. So it's way out. It's beautiful. It doesn't look like you're in New York at all. There's an amazing view of the bay. And then on the other side, there's a view of the Whitestone Bridge, which is an impressive bridge. It was really cool. And there was also a castle that used to be the mess hall. And now it's the Bayside Historical Society's offices. But yeah, you would just be riding along and you're like, oh, there's a castle. There's an abandoned hospital. There's a totally normal looking building, etc. And one other interesting detail was the front gate to the fort had these circular things on top of the gate. And there was one on each side on like a large post. And they were mines, like mines that had been defused or whatever, and they were just there decoratively, which was very strange. I will say, if you live in New York City, it is not easy to get to Fort Totten. I biked there, and basically to give you a sense of how far away it is, Astoria is about 10 miles away from the financial district of Manhattan, right? Like the southern tip of Manhattan. And Astoria is also about 10 miles away from Fort Totten, which is in Queens. Like you can bike that much and still be in Queens, which is just wild to think about. I think that as the crow flies, it's closer, but if you're actually trying to get there, it takes longer. And I also got to bike on my way there along the Flushing Bay Promenade, which I think is now called the Malcolm X Promenade. I think it was renamed like a couple days before I biked there. And it was cool. It's right next to LaGuardia Airport. Like it's on the bay that LaGuardia is on, which is very weird. And, the views were sort of pretty. It was also right next to Citi Field where the Mets play. And, there were a decent number of people biking along there, etc. I managed to get my first flat tire there because that promenade is in bad condition and has tons of potholes. And then also right next to it, there is an asphalt factory that smelled terrible. So mixed bag. I actually do recommend going to Fort Totten if you're in New York. It's really cool. But just be aware that mass transit doesn't really go there. Like, it's possible that there's a bus, maybe. But the subway definitely doesn't go near there. And it's a little bit of a pain even biking within Queens to get there. But it was worth it for sure. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is, I sometimes talk about books that I'm reading, and usually I talk about nonfiction books, but I actually read a book that I think a lot of people who enjoy this podcast would enjoy, and it's fiction. And the book is called The Chosen and the Beautiful. It's written by Nevo, and it's a Great Gatsby retelling that has magic in it, and it's told from Jordan Baker's perspective. And it's really cool because parts of it, word for word, are the same as, in the book, The Great Gatsby. Just you're seeing it from another character's perspective. And the inclusion of the magic was really cool. And it's a really nice book to read during the summer because, The Great Gatsby is such a summer book. It happens over the course of like a wild summer. And it's a great book if you like, historical New York, if you like fiction with a touch of magic. It's also really cool because the character of Jordan Baker in this version is Vietnamese and adopted. So there's a lot of really cool and interesting stuff about like her experience as like a Vietnamese adoptee in 1920s high society, basically. And another thing too is it's super queer, which The Great Gatsby is an extremely queer book. I reread it in January and there were parts that I was like, I don't know how I missed this when I read it as a kid. But if you don't believe me, there's literally a scene during the party scene when Nick goes with Tom and they meet up with Myrtle and I think like Myrtle's sister and the neighbors, and they have that party in Manhattan. There's this scene where Nick leaves the party with this guy, one of the neighbors, who, if I'm remembering right, I think he's described as like sort of an artistic type. And they're in the elevator and they're talking, leaving the party. And then there's basically like a section break. And, you know, Nick's very drunk at this point. So I think it's kind of impressionistic and weird. But so there's kind of like a break. And then it says, I was standing beside his bed and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. So basically, pretty explicitly, it shows him leaving a party to sleep with this artist guy who then shows him his portfolio, which feels right. But I had never noticed that before in previous readings, and when I reread it in January, I was like, huh, that's weird. So, like, I would say that The Chosen and the Beautiful is a queer version of The Great Gatsby, but The Great Gatsby is already explicitly a book with queer characters. But I will say that The Chosen and the Beautiful is like super, super queer, which is awesome. So, a really fun book, pretty quick read, great for the summer, kind of has the perfect confluence of all the stuff I'm interested in. And that probably goes for you as well, listener. All right, that's all I had that I wanted to talk about for this time. You can check out the show notes with all my sources at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. If you liked this, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review on whatever podcatcher you use, but especially Apple Podcasts. And you can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. And thanks so much for listening.